people kind of roll in, we're going to just get started. So today we're going to be doing some grammar review in particular, but we are going to be going through and just making sure everyone's on the same page for the whole process for the reading strategies, and then to kind of see where everyone is. So this week, what was due for homework was practice test 10. So we'll be going through some of that. For homework of this coming week, you will have practice test 9, I believe, which I'll double check, and you'll receive that through the homework email as you typically do. So without further ado, we'll kind of get started. So one thing I do kind of want us to do, I know we've kind of briefly looked at the kind of grammar and kind of writing concepts and editing concepts that are part of the SAT, but I do want to kind of go into more depth with them and just kind of quickly do some kind of brushing up of those kinds of skills, the types of grammar in particular that you'll be looking at most frequently on the SAT, because there's a huge variety of, quite a variety of different types of grammar concepts, writing concepts, editing concepts, reading concepts even, because writing and reading and thinking all go side by side, hand in hand. So we do kind of want to make sure that we at least brush up on some of those to get you started. I can certainly discuss doing a more intensive grammar review if there's enough interest to be able to, or I can work one-on-one with students going forward. You would just have to contact Embrace to be able to do that, so that we can make sure that you get the kind of grammar review that you need, because everyone's kind of, everyone should know this material, but you might not remember the exact terminology, and I don't want you to panic when you see it, or when they're asking you for a certain to identify like what a subordinate clause is, or what anything really, like a restrictive clause or non-restrictive clause, essential clauses, all of those different types of things that it can get kind of confusing because people don't think about them every day unless you're a grammarian or a linguist like I am, or are learning foreign languages or a writing tutor or something like that, where you're an editor or something where you're constantly working with grammar and with language. And so without further ado, I kind of want to get started here. So bear with me as I share my screen. So actually the first thing that I really wanted to do is kind of check in with people about the reading. So I've recommended reading. It's been on your homework and required it as much as I can. I gently encourage everyone to do the reading that I've assigned, because it's going to provide you with key information. Look through the links that I've included for additional resources and information, because much of the time that's going to help answer a lot of your questions, so that we can focus on your strategies and refining your techniques so that we can get you going where you need to be. All right, so kind of just kind of recapping. So like the first week I did this first week that I was with you, which would have been your second week here in the course, I had asked everyone to read, I believe, chapters 1 to 4. And then, which is really just kind of introducing you. The first 2 chapters are really introducing you to the SAT itself, which I'm not really going to look at here because I expect everyone to have done the reading. And we're going to kind of focus more on your strategies here. But what I did want to talk about was the reading that was due for today, which is about the reading test and the writing and language test and the math tests, because those kinds of chapters and the expanded kind of chapters after them, after each of those sections in the textbook or online in the online resources that I gave you, or in the links here, are, and again, this document is the document you received your first class from me. So you all have this. So I don't need to provide it to you again. You should have it from your very first class with me. So this again is just kind of taking a look at the SAT test makers, so at the College Board's breakdown of what each section entails. Okay, so kind of thinking about what they see in each of these sections that they're testing you on, not necessarily what the actual material is that they are testing you on, because their focus is more on the outcome of the exam and what the colleges and universities are really looking for, rather than what you as a student need to truly know to be able to achieve success on this exam. So it's important for you to kind of read through at least the about chapters for each section, because it does give you kind of the breakdown of the content and the different things like that. So like, for instance, if we look at about chapter 5, which was due for today, about the reading test, it kind of, I'm not going to read through all of this with everyone because you should have done the reading, but as everyone should kind of know now, it goes over genre, it goes over purpose, kind of key features of the reading test passages, which is useful. And I've kind of discussed some of this in the context of our discussion of approaching the strategies and kind of the broader kind of educational topics that are related to the reading test here. We will dive into the writing and language test after I kind of go through these. So this I just kind of wanted to give as a introduction and just kind of recap and check in with everyone and where they've been with the homework, in terms of the reading homework specifically, and just kind of draw your attention to it if you haven't done the reading. So please do the reading if you have not done it. I know it seems like a lot, and I know that it is, in addition to all of your other studies and commitments, but it is important. It's created specifically for you, so you by the test makers, so that you can know what's on the test. So you want to look at all the information that's available to you about the SAT, and that includes the reading, even though it might seem silly to you, or it might not seem as productive as doing practice tests. It's a good supplement to practice tests because it allows you to become more familiar with what the test is and what it does and what the kinds of things that the test makers are looking for you to do on this test. Okay, so you always want to look at as many clues as you can to give yourself an idea of how to succeed with this test. Okay, so a lot of the things, like I said, this covers for the reading test passages. Key features include things like genre. And if you're not sure what genre is, please email me and we will go over it. But I expect all of you to have at least some awareness of what genre means in terms of literature, in terms of kind of understanding like informational or informative passages and literary passages, and kind of dealing with things like historical or cultural kind of viewpoints or documents and things like that, as well as kind of literary criticism and things like that you should all be somewhat aware of at this point in your high school career. So purpose as well, dealing with their goal, or the goal in writing, specifically the goal in writing in terms of like the author. You always want to think about a text in terms of the author, the reader or the intended audience, and the purpose of writing. So what form is this? What genre of writing are we dealing with? So genre being different than literary genre, because you're dealing with what type of work are you dealing, like what's your purpose? So you have we have informational writing, explanatory writing, persuasive writing, argumentative writing, narrative writing, and like so many others. But those, like the main genres are what we're looking for you to know and which you should all be familiar with from your English classes and other classes in terms of writing and recording information or presenting it, or like um, just understanding what it is and how it relates to things like fiction or nonfiction, in terms of literary type of genre, or dealing with like categories to put different types of written works in, which is what really this genre is up here. So you want to kind of think about those types of things in terms of this test and the passages that you're reading, and what their kind of overall purpose is, that they want you to take away, in addition to the kind of information of the content of each passage that you're supposed to be processing. So, and then answering questions about. So all of these kinds of key things, key features of a text are always going to help you rather than hinder you on this test, because they're going to provide key information for you about the text. And the more information you have about a given work, the easier the passage is going to be for you, and the easier the questions are going to be for you. But the key is always knowing how to find that information if you're not, or just to be able to find the information that you specifically need to answer the questions. Because remember, our goal with the SAT is always to get to the questions rather than focusing on a particular problem, or focusing on a particular reading passage or writing and language passage, or what have you. So subject, again, we kind of have gone over that. So everyone at this point really should have their preferred order of, or at least their current preferred order of passages for the reading test. So this includes like whether you're going to approach the history, like humanities based, social studies based passages first, whether you're doing literature, whether you're doing science, whether you're doing the paired passage, all of those types of things, or if you're doing social science first. Everyone should have an idea about their order, because we should be continuing to refine our strategies at this point. Okay, so you understand the basic strategies at this point, I would imagine, I'm hoping. And if you don't, please make note of it in the comments for me, and I can clarify anything that I've gone over before. But it is important for you to start practicing and kind of really focusing in on what you see, like what these techniques are and how you can become so adept at them that it's going to, you're going to nail the test, basically. So, I mean, I have confidence in every single one of you that you're going to be able to do far better than you even think you can on this test. And it just comes with practice, and it comes with putting in the time and the effort to do well here. Complexity is another kind of text feature here in the reading test section, because you're dealing with as I'm sure all of you have seen by now, sometimes a literary passage or a science passage even could feel like it's a lot easier to you. And that has a lot to do with the kind of language or jargon that they use, that's technical language that they're using or throwing at you, or whether or not it's a concept that you're familiar with or that you've studied before, in terms of like sciences, or in history, it's a historical passage or historical work that you've read or you're familiar with the author. All of those kinds of things kind of come into play in terms of text complexity. It also has to do with like the length and like the number of words, the level of the vocabulary that's being used, the like the types of techniques and things that are there, how much you have to kind of infer from the text. All those types of things come into play with a reading passage like this. So you really want to, I mean, this is true for any text you read ever. Some texts are going to come more easily to you than others. It's just how things are, the nature of reading. But this is a consideration that they make on the reading test portion of the SAT. So you do want to kind of consider that, looking at like the kind of concepts of paired passages and how they kind of break them down, looking at their kind of discussion of the informational graphics. All of these types of things are really key to helping you become more familiar and more comfortable with this particular section of the test, as well as all the other sections. Um, so I'm not going to really kind of belabor what they've kind of said. So they're focusing, other than to kind of say that what I've said before here about their kind of breakdown of the skills that they're saying that you do. Yes, technically the reading test focuses on three kind of general categories of information and ideas: rhetoric and synthesis. In terms of how you approach material, in terms of being presented with data, being presented with information, and then having to kind of think what you have to actually do with that information. Also, kind of understanding what rhetoric is and how we use it to communicate, and kind of the techniques and strategies, things that go hand in hand with writing and editing and reading. So all of those kinds of things, but writing in particular for rhetoric, writing and speaking. But synthesis is more of like your processing of ideas. So your analysis, your interpretation, your ability to dissect information, examine it, kind of take it and apply it, and be able to bring it to a higher level of apply it at a higher level of knowledge. So whether or not you're just initially being exposed to the information, or you're thinking more critically about it, and you're being asked to then take it and present it in a different way, or argue in for a particular purpose. So all those kinds of things go into hand in hand with the reading test here. And then they do give you kind of a neat little overview, which is helpful, although I've gone over this too, that there's a total of 52 questions on this section. And generally you have 65 minutes on, which is roughly 1 minute and 15 seconds per question, or 12 minutes in total per passage, inclusive of your reading time. Number of passages that you get: 4 single passages plus 1 pair of passages. And then you have 500 to 750 words for approximately 3,000 to 250. So all of these kinds of things, and it goes over the subjects as well, in terms of how many of each type of subject each type of passage you get, or each subject of the passage that you get, which we've discussed before as well. And then it gives you kind of a breakdown about the specific kind of grade level for the range of text complexity. So it's geared towards those in 9th to 10th to early post-secondary. So there's like the beginning of high school through upper level, like beyond high school. So you really have to kind of think about, like, depending on which type of text you get, it can vary considerably. But there will always be the same kind of breakdown of passages. It just might be that the history one is more hard on a particular test than it is, or more complex on a particular test, because of when the text originates, the date that it originates from. So or it might be the science one. So it just varies in terms of which one is going to be the most complex, but there's still generally the same level of complexity in total, the same kind of range. So you'll have what's viewed as more of an easier one to the more challenging and difficult ones, and the order in which they appear is not set, so they can come in any order. Just remember that you always want to approach the passages in your preferred order, and to adjust that order if you need to, as you kind of go through. So yeah, that's kind of just recapping about the reading test here. I do kind of want us to go through. Did everyone actually see that at all? Nope, I don't think anyone saw that. I forgot I did click on it, but I didn't actually get to go through it. So give me 1 second. and I can kind of just show you. So I was just going through as I was talking there. I apologize. I forgot to switch my screen. But about the reading test. So this is the document. So everyone can access that through the initial document I had up on screen, or directly through the College Board's website. So this is just kind of the chapter one of the chapters you were supposed to be reading about the reading test in particular. And it kind of goes through and does that breakdown that I was just discussing. Everyone should have read this already, so this shouldn't be news to you. But if you haven't, please review it and periodically look through this as you do your review every week, or every as you go in preparation for the test, because it's going to remind you what the test is, or what this section of the test is about. And in addition to the notes that I provide each week, so it's going to kind of give you key information about test and help you in your journey to make sure that you get as familiar as possible with the test. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing that one now. And this time I will actually properly share. It's first thing in the morning on Saturday. So, all right. So the next one that I kind of wanted to kind of recap before we really dive into grammar today is about the SAT writing and language test. And we'll go into a little bit more detail just to kind of recap the content and strategies for this particular section before going back to a little bit more about the reading test and just reaffirming our strategies before we tackle that today. But everyone, let me make sure that I've shared this. There we go. Okay, so everyone should see on their screen chapter 10 about the SAT writing and language test. So again, this was part of your assigned reading for this past week. So you do want to make sure that you've read it, or that you at least look through it for me, because it has a lot of valuable information for you, just like the reading test one that I just kind of skimmed through here. So really, the format here is remember that the key difference between the reading test and the writing and language test is that the reading test has passages from actual authors, famous authors, professional writers, essayists, things like that they are from renowned sources, basically, whereas reputable sources, whereas the writing and language test is specifically designed by the test makers. So these are passages specifically created for this section of the test because it gives the College Board direct control over the language that they use, and they don't have to kind of try to rework or rephrase or figure out how to change what they're trying to say, or so that it is an incorrect answer or different things like that than what they're looking at. They have a lot more control over it, which is why this section is a little bit tricky, because it really kind of looks at it requires you to not only think about what the current question that you're on, but you also have to think about the rest of the text up until that point, as well as the text as a whole, just like you would with any piece of writing. But in this case, the information that what makes it tricky in particular is that the information that is scattered up above in the actual passage may be incorrect, maybe not the right choice. So you can get a lot of these ideas jumbled up in your mind when you're looking through a writing and language test section, because they throw errors at you left and right, and then they ask you to make choices, and sometimes you have to make a judgment or a choice based on previous answers in order to understand whether or not something actually fits where it's where it's located, or if it should be moved or it should be removed. All of those types of things kind of come into play when you're dealing with the writing and language test. So I feel like it would be easier if you knew that you were dealing with a like if we broke down the language of one of the reading test passages, it would be much easier for students because you could say, yeah, this is a great example of writing. I mean, it's by an exceptional author. It has plenty of evidence to support its claim. It's very clear, concise, and or at least depending on the text you're looking at. But like those types of considerations are come into play here because the passages in the reading and the writing and language test can be confusing. Okay, so you want to approach it line by line in many cases, and so you want to actually spend most of your time on the questions, which is what you should do anyway. But for any section of this test, is spend majority of your time on the questions. But you do want to be able to focus on what an individual question is asking, what level of a question you're dealing with. So whether or not you're dealing with something on a word level, or you're dealing with it on a paragraph level, or if it's like what kind of issue are you dealing with specifically, which I'm going to go through a breakdown of just what that is. But these are kinds of things that you want to think about because you don't want to get confused here because I mean, this is a shorter section than the reading test, but grammar can be tricky for a lot of people. When in doubt, go with what sounds the best or makes the most sense to you. Okay, because chances are the majority of you are native speakers of English. Okay, so chances are your instincts when it comes to language are going to be better than if you were to like if you truly get like, do I use a semicolon here, do I not, does this make sense, is there a pause here or is there not, like with a comma, like all of those types of things you process generally on a day-to-day basis without even thinking when you're speaking to someone or when you're writing a note to your friend or something. Like you can understand a lot more language than you give yourself credit for in most cases. And what they're specifically looking for here are the prescriptive grammar rules. So the rules you learn in school about the best, the quote unquote best version of writing and language. So what you use basically in formal writing, and what's considered kind of like the standard English conventions. Okay, so you've heard me kind of mention that before, but you do want to kind of bear that in mind because that's what they're looking for, are best writing and editing practices for this section of the test. So that includes your knowledge of grammar, includes your knowledge of how to convey ideas, to how to communicate effectively, like all of those kinds of things that you tackle in your English classes and your other writing oriented classes like history or even science, like everything you write with and communicate your ideas with, like all of those skills come into play in this particular section of the exam. So you want to consider yourself as a reader, as a writer, as an editor, all at the same time while you're going through this. So think of it like you're doing a peer review for a friend, where you're reviewing and revising and editing your own essay. And you're trying to make the writing flow more smoothly, you're trying to make it more logical, easier to follow, have sufficient evidence to be able to support the ideas that are being presented, and make sure that everything is connected in some way by some kind of thesis or some kind of theme or central concept that you really want to be looking at or claim, argumentative claim or persuasive claim, like all of those types of things that you want to keep in mind that you need in a good piece of writing in order to effectively communicate the ideas and the message that the author's trying to convey. Okay, so you want to keep all those kinds of things in the back of your mind as you go through this, because as you go through these types of sections, because they're going to try to trick you in terms of whether or not they use a comma, and they're not going to tell you necessarily what specifically they're looking at. Like if you look at question 2, here in this example, you can see it's very different from the structure of 1, which is saying which choice best maintains the sentence pattern already established in the paragraph. And then you have, at least they have one thing in common, is that the first response is typically no change. So it's meaning whatever is listed in the actual text, that's the one that the answer that you would be going with if you select A for no change. But this type of thing is really giving you different types of questions, because some are focused on ideas, some are focused on grammar and punctuation rules. So clearly this one must be a punctuation rule, because you're dealing with a grammar rule by necessity as well. But it's also dealing with mechanics and conventions. It's dealing with understanding how to connect different kinds of phrases or different kinds of clauses together. So there's more going on than than BCI really. What you're looking at here is 4 of these responses have a comma. So at first glance, this might seem like a punctuation question, but it's not. It's clearly focused on the verb, because the verb form changes. Okay. Thankfully, they at least spell it correctly for you. So you don't have to deal with spelling errors in this case. But then you're also noticing that the information on the right-hand side of the comma changes. So that also is dealing with a subject and a verb. So you are dealing with trying to connect these 2 different clauses. So you're dealing with more than what you might see at first glance. So you have to really kind of break down the sentence, and you can never just look at the phrase that they have underlined in isolation. You can't just look at it by itself. You have to look at it at the minimum in the context of the full sentence in which it appears. Generally speaking, you will have to read at least a little bit further above and below it in order to properly answer the question. Sometimes you might even have to read more than that, including at a paragraph level, like a paragraph or 2 above it, depending on the type of question. So generally, when it's a paragraph level, it has more to do with ideas than it does grammar. But it's also like you still need to kind of start within the sentence, build beyond the sentence level to the broader narrative of the paragraph itself and where it is appearing, what type of sentence it's dealing with. Like being able to identify that kind of key information is really important for this section of the test. Okay, we'll go into that in more detail, but I do want to kind of just give you the breakdown here. So just like with the reading test, they do kind of break down, they have a purpose in terms of kind of breaking down what the test makers think is the purpose and subjects and complexity of this section of the exam. Okay, so in purpose, really, they're instead of focusing on you're kind of focused more on writing purpose in terms of like what's the author's intention? Are they writing to inform? Are they writing to persuade? Are they writing to argue? Are they writing to narrate? So some writing passages focus on narrating experiences in a story-like way, but there's no kind of fiction passage on this section as there is on the reading test. Okay, So generally speaking, you're dealing with a nonfiction narrative. So that means the information is going to be factual. So it's going to be dealing with recounting a historical event or relating steps in scientific investigation. So you're dealing with kind of explanatory or argumentative or persuasive information, like types of writing, as well as informative and informational. So your main, a lot of the time, the main purposes of the passages are to inform, to explain. So informative, informational, explanatory. So you're dealing with a lot of expository writing, and or to argue or in support of a claim or to persuade an audience, okay, using particular techniques and strategies. But again, you can still have some narratives so that you have in here that are breaking things down for you, similarly to how we might see some kind of different types of narratives, or specific types of narratives in here, rather than like the typical plot structure that you would see in most stories, or novels or short stories or poems or things like that that could kind of fall into that category. Okay, so you won't see that type as much on here. You will generally see just informational or explanatory based, like things that involve evidence, evidence to be able to support some kind of central idea or thesis, in here, or argumentative claim or something like that. Okay. Questions so far from today? No? I mean, all of this should be reviewed if all of you read through it. So subject, in terms of the writing and language passages, a lot of them the subject areas can include things like career related topics, humanities, history, social studies, science. So in terms of like, the only thing that really is different there than what you see on the reading test are the career related topics. So, but they're not going to be things that are like actually used in an office, like a memo or a report, or they're not like workplace documents specifically. They are more common theoretical arguments or debates about common career pathways, like in healthcare and information technology. They might be talking about emerging fields of science or things like that, or new kinds of jobs and things like that that are coming into being, and kind of getting information about like dealing with more with the job market and things like that. And humanities passages are, again, they can be on anything from arts and letters and include texts like fine art, film, music, literature, and all that kind of thing, or history, social studies things could be texts on topics in history, as well as social sciences like anthropology, archaeology, economics, psychology. You won't generally see a lot of linguistics on here, even though that would fall under that too. But you will see a wide variety of different types of texts. And for those of you who don't know, yeah, linguistics is the study of language, the scientific study, essentially, although it's an interdisciplinary degree. And it's one of my favorite things, as you can probably tell since I like language so much. So science passages cover kind of foundational concepts still. So you're not really being asked to, like I said, it can cover new advances in certain types of science fields. And the complexity level of the text of the passages can vary, but generally they're not going to be quite the same style as a lot of the variation you get in the reading test. It's going to be kind of similar in terms of their text complexity for each passage, but it's not, I mean, there's always going to be a variety. So you'll always have some passages that are easier or harder for you. Okay. Again, there are going to be informational graphics and things in this section too that you need to kind of pay attention to, especially for kind of data response type questions. And then kind of focusing again on things like expression of ideas, standard English conventions. And then they do kind of give you the breakdown of the writing test here So total questions in 44 minutes, and then you have 30 total questions of 44 questions in 35 minutes. So roughly 8 minutes per passage, remember, meaning about a minute per question, inclusive of reading, or under a minute per question, inclusive of reading time is your goal. And that there are typically 4 passages, whereas you have more passages to read through on the reading test, which kind of makes sense. So the length is shorter in general than the things that you'll see on the rating test. So it's only 400 to 450 words. So about 1,700 in total for this section. And then the type of subjects, we just kind of went over the writing modes for the passages. So you'll have 1 nonfiction narrative, 1 to 2 informative or explanatory texts. So that can kind of include informational and other kind of forms of expository writing, and then dealing with 1 to 2 arguments in general. And then again, complexity levels and question numbers are about the same. So they kind of give you a breakdown of the number of questions you'll see for that fall into these categories of question types, or like content, or really like categories is really what we're dealing with here, in terms of like expression of ideas as a category of questions. So there are questions that involve expression of ideas or involve standard English conventions. They're not necessarily specifically on that. They may have a variety of skills that they're testing you on in a given question. Command of evidence, same thing. So your ability to use and interpret and apply information. And they kind of break down the number of questions, the same thing for words in context. So those are kind of more vocabulary oriented words again. So the vocabulary and context type questions, you'll see analysis in history and social studies, which is more of a subscore type area, where you're dealing with questions focused specifically on history or social studies concepts, or ideas and ideology and that type of thing, or within that kind of sphere. The same thing for science. So those are more of specific kind of subscores in terms of the question types that you have. Okay, so everyone should kind of have some familiarity at least with this section. This week for homework, you will be doing more intensive reading on some of the breakdowns of these kinds of concepts, like dealing with where was it? Expression of ideas, standard English and writing conventions, things like that, that you're kind of going to be looking at in your reading for this week. Okay, so you will be dealing with they kind of break down the information, ideas, rhetoric, and synthesis, which was the reading kind of core concepts, core categories of questions that they were kind of dealing with. Whereas with the writing and language test, it's expression of ideas, standard English conventions, etc. So those are kind of the core writing type questions, writing and language type questions you'll see. A little later today, we'll go through the math section. I don't want to kind of get you too confused by jumping back and forth. So I want us to kind of just finish up with the reading and the writing and language test first before, or at least for today, and then move towards the math for the second half of today after our break. So we'll take a break in a little while. But I did kind of want to just go through and see. So what I wanted us to look at, actually it should be in here. So we've kind of gone through, I know we've kind of gone through, again, I just kind of recapped here, but 12 minutes per passage reading test, the kinds of general questions, big picture, little picture, detail-oriented type questions, inferencing questions, function usage questions, vocabulary and context questions, analogy, author technique, evidence support, data reasoning. Does anyone have any questions on those particular types or the order in which we should approach those sections before I kind of dive into our grammar review here? Does it make sense for everyone in terms of the general reading strategies like the SQ3R, the RIP rep, the skim reading, the scanning, the additional kind of reading strategies that I provided through the resources? And again, this is from the document that you received from my first class, which was your second class, with all of you. Again, the kind of breakdown. So everyone should at this point have your breakdown for your passages for the reading test. You should also be working on timing. So making sure that you're trying to stay within that 12 minutes. Is anyone struggling to be in that 12-minute time frame for the reading test for each passage? Anyone kind of completely like not sure what I'm talking about? If so, please let me know in the chat or in the Q&A. No one? Okay, so I'm going to assume then that all of you understand and have been pretty much able to stay within that kind of goal of 12 minutes per passage and that you haven't struggled to complete the reading test within the given time frame. If that's not true, please let me know and I can kind of go over the step-by-step process of breaking down how to adapt your strategy if you do find yourself running out of time, even though it's broken down in this document for you. And I did discuss it, I think, in previous class. But basically, remember, on every test, every section of this exam, you're using process of elimination to help you eliminate answer choices. You're only doing a single slash or a like horizontal line, whatever like I have here, through the letter of the answer choice when you respond to a question. And this is true on any section of this exam. Okay, because the key is you want to save yourself time and energy. So that's why you focus only on the answer, on the letter of the answer to cross it off instead of trying to like scratch everything out and say, no, that's not it. That's going to waste so much effort and energy. So don't do that. Try to conserve your strength as you go through this test. It's in your best interest to answer as many questions on the exam as possible. So you want to make sure that you do that. So if you get to a point, you always want to try to be able to narrow down your answer choices so you can make as an educated of a guess or as an informed decision about your answer choice as possible. But if you find that you don't have that luxury because you're pressed for time, you can do what's called a cold guess and choose a letter that you're going to use for the whole test for each section. That's basically your letter of choice for the day that you are using to do for your cold guess. So say I'm going to use A today for my cold guess. Have that set ahead of time before you even start the exam. And just stick with that if you have to make an absolutely cold guess where you don't have a chance to eliminate some of the answer choices and make it an educated guess instead. So that's only used as a last resort. You always want to try to eliminate at least some of the answer choices if you can, and then make an educated guess based on the question, what it's asking, and the information at hand in the given section you're dealing with. Does that all make sense? Okay. All right. So I'm assuming that everyone is fine with timing right now. Everyone should be timing your tests every week and being very rigid in terms of your the amount of time you give yourself to take this test, because if you don't and you give yourself extra time, you're going to run out of time on the actual test and you won't be able to get through the test. So you need to be diligent every single week and disciplined, and make sure you're timing yourself very strictly as you complete each section of the test, so that you are staying within the overall time limit for the given section, but you're also staying, especially if for the reading and the writing test, you want to make sure you're staying within that allotted time frame for each passage, for each one. So 12 minutes per passage or paired passage. And for the reading test, and um, 8 minutes for the writing and language test. Does that all make sense, everyone? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So if you find you just stumble across a question that you feel like you don't know, you can't answer based on the like, you feel like you're wasting time on it, or it's taking you too long to kind of process what the question's asking, try to make an educated guess, and or like note it on your answer sheet and come back at the end, and move. But you always want to move on, so you always want to go from the easiest questions that you can answer immediately down to the hardest, okay, that you need to spend more time on. So you always want to try to be like, okay, I've read through this 2 times already and I'm not getting it, so I need this question and I need to move on now. Or I can't even make it through the first few words of this question, so I'm just going to take a cold guess and come back, or something, so that you can focus on other questions. Just make sure that you're being very careful about where you're putting your answers and keeping track of what you need to, so that you can come back to it at the end, because that 12-minute time limit for each passage is going for the reading test is going to help you, give you some buffer time at the end to be able to come back and address questions that you didn't get a chance to that you need to spend more time on, or you need to kind of revisit. And always check your work. Always try to check your work as you go through, at the very end. Like, that's what you do in that time frame. If you don't have specific questions, you have to kind of go back and revisit. Okay. Everyone should also be making sure that you're identifying the types of questions that are the most challenging for you and the ones that are the easiest. Okay, so even though I've gone through a particular order of questions in terms of my recommendations for you, in terms of what is best for most students, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is the best order for you, but this is a tried and true method to help you get through this section of the test, to help you tackle the questions in order of difficulty. So you want to go progressively, always from easiest to hardest. And some questions might be harder for you than others, and it might vary depending on which passage you're dealing with, or what test you're given. So all of that can kind of affect your overall kind of decision here, in terms of which question is easiest for you or not, and what strategy you ultimately employ in the midst of a given test. But you do want to make sure that you have at least a goal in mind, that you're trying to, and that you're trying to, the strategy that you apply consistently as much as possible. So everyone every week should be identifying the question types and examine your incorrect responses. So I can't do that for you. You have to do that, and you have to tell me what questions you have each week, or if there are particular ones you want to go over. So I expect everyone to be doing that. So far, we've only had a few questions here or there. So most students seem to have been able to address their own questions, or that the answers and explanations have kind of cleared things up for most students. But if there are ones that just don't make sense to you, don't be afraid. Please let me know. Put it in the chat, or message me directly, go through the Q&A or something like that. Okay, so that we can make sure that you get your questions answered, so you can do well and succeed on those particular types of questions. Make a list of the types of questions you answered incorrectly every week and note whether your errors were the result of not reading carefully enough or paying enough attention to the text or questions, or if you did not understand the content and the question being asked. The first part of that, where you're not reading quite carefully enough or not quite paying enough attention, that's easier to address than the latter part, which is dealing with content about or understanding the question. Okay. Quick fixes are the first thing we want to fix so that you can start immediately getting those answers right. If you don't understand certain parts or certain types of questions, and how to specifically approach them, you need to tell me so that I can kind of troubleshoot that, because chances are you're not the only student who doesn't know how to approach that section, or there might be another student who can approach that, who could explain it to you perhaps. So you all kind of want to think about that as you approach as you do your self-scoring each week, and kind of keep kind of a running tally in a notebook, a specific notebook, because all of you should be having a notebook for this class. That was part of your kind of initial course materials for our class, so that you can kind of keep a record of what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what types of questions you get wrong, certain and keep a running list of formulae, or a running list of grammar concepts or things of that nature that are, or vocabulary if you're working on that, to help you get through the exam ultimately. So every little bit counts. Okay. So don't be afraid to ask a question if you have one. Okay. Always identify your errors when you self-score your practice test. So everyone should be doing this every week. Okay, so it doesn't matter. Even if you feel like, oh, it's silly, I understand what I did or didn't get wrong, you should still be doing it and identifying, did I just make a careless error, or did I make it, or is this more of like a content question that I just don't understand? And then we can try to address it. But unless you make note of it and let me know about it, I'm not going to know. So I won't know to go over a positive phrases or something like that. Okay. So you can also email me if you don't want to address it directly in class. You can email me. Everyone can, to let me know or ask me in class, and we can review specific question types or content areas in more depth, depending on need. Okay. So everyone should also be very familiar now with the instructions. So if you don't have it memorized, that's okay, but you should be at least familiar enough with the instructions. It is advised that you memorize it. If you're not sure how to go about memorizing information, email me and I can give you some suggestions and kind of key practices to help you get through that. But everyone should be familiar enough with the instructions for each section that they only really have to skim read them at this point to be able to make sure nothing's changed, and that you can just continue focusing exclusively on the section at hand. Okay. Everyone should also be reading the introductory information for the passage every week, for every single passage. And that also includes information for the infographics and different things like that too. You always want to be looking at that kind of little blurb that's there to give you context clues about whatever it is at hand, whether it's a passage, whether it's an infographic or chart or whatever. A lot of key information, important information can be there. And if you don't do the reading, you are not going to, you're going to miss it. And you could miss out on answering a question that you'll otherwise get wrong. Okay. And we want you to get questions right. We don't want you to have to get them wrong if it can be helped. Read the passages and annotate as you read. So everyone should know that they're doing the reading at least once of each passage. Okay. Ideally twice, but this test doesn't particularly allow that for most students. So you want to be annotating as you read. So you always want to be aiming to get to the questions. So never linger on the passages. If you're running out of time on a passage, which is kind of what I wanted to just recap here for those of you who might struggle with reading or who might struggle with particular types of passages that are just not your cup of tea or whatever, you want to make sure that if you're running out of time on any passage, or are not a strong reader, or you're getting bogged down in the first few paragraphs, and just not understanding what the author's saying, you can, I'm like, you should know within reading the first few paragraphs, whether or not you can read the whole thing, or whether or not you have to spend more time doing reading. Don't waste the time doing reading, doing extra reading for this particular test. On any other test, yes, read and reread and reread and annotate and annotate and annotate. Okay. But you don't have that luxury on the SAT. So because of that, you can do a strategy that will allow you to read the first paragraph or so. Sometimes the first paragraph or two is kind of recommended, but at least the initial, like the introduction, basically, and the conclusion. Okay, those you're going to read in entirety. And that means you're reading the whole thing, from top to bottom of the introduction and of the conclusion. But before you read the conclusion, you need to read through and annotate, but you're doing things like circling proper nouns and numbers. You're also underlining key words and phrases that you think. So you're kind of skim reading through the rest, but your focus, instead of reading through every single word, is to look for those kind of key elements, like circling the proper nouns and numbers, looking for vocabulary, things that jump out at you that you think could be important, that you want to go back to. But focus your reading then, after you've read the introduction, to reading only your introductory, like the topic sentence and the concluding sentence of each paragraph, so that you can make sure you have those underlined as you're going through and looking for proper nouns and numbers, and doing other kind of keyword or annotations in the margins as you go through, to kind of jog your memory about what each paragraph is about, or what each section, like what a particular section of a passage is about, so that you can get through the passage without having to do the full reading. And then you read through the conclusion in entirety, and then you tackle the questions. So the key is always to get to the questions before you can get to anything else. So if you are getting bogged down by a particular passage, don't despair. Don't just continuously try to reread and reread and reread until you get so lost in it that you can't get out of it. You always want to say, this is more complex than I can take. I don't understand what they're saying, so I'm going to get to the questions and let the questions guide me, because the questions will guide you to finding the information. And then it's really just you hunting for information in the text to answer the questions, rather than you having to focus on what the passage itself is saying. So you always want to use the questions to help you, rather than getting lost in a passage and not having time to get to the questions. Okay. Anyone have any questions on that, or what I mean by that kind of strategy? So that's what you would do if you're like on your last section, like, or if the paired passage in particular is really tricky for you. You can do this on the paired passage, where you're looking at each of the, in which case you'd have two passages to read like that. But so doing the first paragraph, the last paragraph, and the topic and concluding sentences, as well as doing your annotations, because you always are doing your annotations. It just matters whether or not you're doing a full critical read or not. Or if you're doing more of kind of like the skimming of those paragraphs, as you would when you'd be doing the strategy. So that kind of being said, you do always want to move to the questions if you find yourself getting lost in a given passage, and never spend more than 5 minutes doing your annotation or reading through a given passage. If you are wasting too much time, move on to the questions and come back. Move on to the questions so that you can answer them, at least the one, and you'll be starting again, if you're following the strategy of starting with detail-oriented questions first and building to big picture questions. So by doing that kind of strategy, you're going to build your understanding gradually of what the passage is saying so that you can answer those bigger picture questions and be able to understand, have a general idea about what the passage was about to the extent that you need it in order to answer the questions, okay? Instead of having to have a full understanding of what the text is telling you from the get-go after reading through the whole thing. So this is a good strategy. You can use it on one section in a test. You can also use it on all of them, but you want a higher probability of getting all questions right. So you want to do as much reading as you can. So I recommend this strategy in particular if you're not a quick reader, in which case then we can kind of customize your particular strategy so that you are spending more time on like you're doing a full read of your strongest passages, and then you might be doing this strategy on weaker passages, on ones that give you the most trouble. But a word of caution, if you are using this, is that you can miss key information this way. So that's why it's always important to try your best to be able to get through a passage. But if you realize that there's just no way you're understanding what the author's saying, don't get lost. Just move to the questions and come back. Okay. And then you can just hunt for information. Okay. So that is the best strategy for you to do if you kind of run into this type of situation in a test. And it doesn't matter whether or not this is in your kind of regimen, your approach for every single test, or if it's just kind of in your back pocket ready to go in case you come across a situation like this. You can certainly use it. So use it when, like, adapt your strategy. Your reading strategy will change depending on your needs and depending on the passages that are thrown at you and their topics, their complexity. All of that is going to affect when you employ certain strategies, whether or not you're doing the SQ3R or whatever. If you're doing a different type of strategy, depending on what type of question, like what type of passage it is, your reading strategies can change. So it's okay if they change, but you want to make sure that you are comfortable enough and able to adapt as needed in a given testing situation. Okay. So that all kind of being said, we've kind of gone through all this already, but again, just to recap: reading strategy, detail-oriented, then inferencing type questions, evidence support, technique, data reasoning, function or usage, analogy type questions, big picture type questions. Those are the things that that's the order, that's the best order for kind of going through the questions on the reading test. So I do kind of want to move on to writing and language again, and then we'll switch gears and do math. Okay. But writing and language, again, all of this is in the notes that I gave you in week 2. So our first class, but for me, or at least my first class, but your second class. Okay. So just to recap again, we've kind of discussed it already today, but the writing and language test, 8 minutes per passage roughly. Okay. Doing the same kinds of strategies that you're doing with the reading test, in terms of annotation, in terms of identifying keywords and concepts, coding passages, circling proper nouns and numbers, all of that, including circling the box numbers that they have in the passage, noting main ideas, topic sentences, and details. And it's going to help you kind of find information in the passage. Although I will tell you that you don't need to do quite as much or as intensive of annotation on this section of the test as you need to on the reading test. That will vary from student to student, but that's generally the case because you have to focus so much on your kind of internal dialogue in relating to the grammar concepts, relating to the ideas that are being expressed, interpreting as an editor, focusing on reading. You're doing more in your head work than you are having to kind of comb through a text to find information as much, or having to make notes about, so you can refer back to it later for this section. But annotation is still very helpful, especially in identifying key information, or helping you kind of keep track at least of the general ideas that are being discussed in a given passage, because you have to be able to understand the ideas that and the message that the author is trying to convey and their purpose for writing, as well as the genre that they're using in terms of the kind of work they're dealing with, or the kind of writing genre they're dealing with, and dealing with understanding like who their audience is, what kinds of messages are being conveyed, like all of that. You kind of really want to understand all of that kind of key information. So you're looking at a text as an editor, as a writer, as an author, as an author might, as a publisher might, in terms of, is this ready to be, like, is this as good as it's going to get for now? Are we calling this the final draft? Are we saying it's ready for public view? Are we dealing with something that needs to be heavily revised, or are we just doing a final proofread? What are we doing? So thinking about the writing process, thinking about the editing process and the revision process and the publishing process, all of that, the thinking process that goes along with writing, all of that is kind of what you're doing. So you're more in your head with this section of the test than you are, I think, with other sections in general, just because you have to be able to wear so many hats, so to speak, in terms of approaching a given section. So you have to think about that as you're approaching each individual question and try to identify specifically what the question's asking you to solve for. And again, these are kinds of some of the main skills that you'll see: knowledge and grammar of mechanics of language, standard English conventions, expression of ideas, editing, punctuation, redundancy, repetition, data interpretation, analysis. And then I do kind of want to get into some of these, this long, lengthy list of grammar concepts. So I'm going to stop sharing for now and share something else for now. And I do kind of want to, we'll do more work in what I'm about to share in a future session too. But I do want to spend a little bit of time here. So this is from the SAT and ACT Grammar Mastery book by Christian Heath. So this is a text that's kind of devoted to understanding grammar that you need for the SAT. This is not available online. This is a text that I own, that I'm sharing with everyone right now. So I do not have any copyright. Some, like, just, it can't be photographed or copied or anything like that. So this is just more for our reference, to kind of give us a frame of reference in terms of understanding grammar. Although actually there was one thing. So I did want to kind of just introduce you to this text in general, and they kind of go over some general ideas, as you might be able to see on the table of contents. So they're going over things like parts of speech. All of you should know what parts of speech are. If you don't, let me know. Eliminating details, rearranging word order, subject-verb agreement, and verb tense and form, adjectives, adverbs, pronoun, antecedent, clarity, a lot more with pronoun and antecedent, agreement, pronoun, case, conjunctions and transitions, punctuation marks, sentence structure, parallelism and comparisons, all of these kinds of things, misplaced modifiers, vocab, word choice, so diction, really, redundancy and wordiness, objective kind of questions, adding and removing information, moving sentences and paragraphs. So this is all kind of what I've been talking to you about in terms of this section. So dealing with things like idioms and prepositions. What I like about this text in particular for most students is that they provide a lot of examples. They have practice tests, like a pre-test, post-test about particular grammar concepts. I think that there's a lot more that can be said about grammar, but this does kind of give you the nitty-gritty breakdown of what is most common on the test. You'll notice in my kind of breakdown here, there are a lot more. So things like homophones, concision of language, precision of language, conventional expressions, non-restrictive, non-essential clauses, restrictive essential clauses, appositive phrases, which were mentioned, comma splices, semicolon usage, colon usage, dealing with dangling and misplaced modifiers, not just misplaced modifiers, dealing with run-on sentences or fragments or dashes or language formality, all of these different things. There's so much more to grammar, but these are a lot of the key concepts that are on here. So things that are mentioned in the book that I was just kind of referring you to a moment ago doesn't have everything. And it's not going to cover every single thing that's going to be on the test. It's going to be covering what is most commonly on the test, or the basics that you need to know in order to succeed on the writing and language test, to be able to identify them. I'll save it for next week, that we'll go into more depth with kind of the grammar. But one thing I did kind of want to go over first, if I can find it, it's on here somewhere. Okay. So these are kind of like, I do kind of want to go over a little bit about language. I mean, to understand more about, like, all of you use language every day. You don't necessarily think about it when you are, but languages are kind of evolving. I mean, they're kind of living things, and they're evolving, like the people and civilizations that use them grow and change. So they're adapting with time. So it's always evolving. So change generally happens in a language very slowly. So we want to kind of consider that in terms of, especially in terms of our understanding of standard English conventions. The standard English conventions are staying the same for the majority of the time that people live, like of a lifetime. They tend to stay very kind of steady. But every language is kind of intricately intertwined with writing, speaking, and thinking, as I've kind of said every single week here. Okay. All languages also follow specific rules and have their own unique grammar. Grammar kind of encompasses the whole system and structure of a language, or of languages in general, and it's broken down into several distinct categories or linguistic functions of a language. So basically, when you're thinking of grammar, you're dealing with the rules that govern a particular language. So from how it's used, how it conveys meaning, to how to form words, phrases, and sentences, how to communicate, like the rules of communication within a given group or society or cultural group. All of that kind of comes into play. What you need to know for the SAT in particular is this information regarding the standard form of American English, which is the one that you've learned in school and is the focus of the SAT. Okay. So what you need to really know for the SAT is the standard form of the language. Okay. So you need to understand what you use, what you're supposed to be using when you write. Okay. When you're doing formal writing. So anytime your English teacher has asked you to write an essay, think about the skills and techniques and strategies that you use when you do that kind of skill. when you're writing a formal essay, when you're writing a research paper, when you're writing just taking notes in class, like things like that, that you are being asked to be clear, be concise, use kind of your knowledge of language to help you communicate your ideas, okay? And do that effectively. So the basics that you really need to know for the SAT in terms of the writing and language test are things like word order and classification. So knowing that the 8 parts of speech are simply, that's kind of the overarching category for classifying words in a language, in our language, okay, in English. In understanding what order, the order in which these types of words appear dictates their function and their use and how we communicate, how meaning is communicated to from a speaker to an audience, okay, or a writer to an audience, okay. So 8 parts of speech, everyone should be familiar with these already. So they're nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, conjunctions, prepositions, interjections. Might not be one that you really heard of, but it is something you're familiar with. So anytime you say the word in front of like something you're going to say, I just said it there. But that is an example of an interjection. It's basically like the catch-all for grammatical utterances that don't fit into any of the other categories, okay, of words. Okay, so they typically occur before a sentence. Sometimes they can happen inside the sentence itself. But like if you say, oh, well, I don't know, the O part of that doesn't fit into any of the other categories. It fits into interjections, okay, because it's being inserted as before to kind of give pause or to indicate that to your listener, to your audience, that you're thinking, you're taking time to respond, or you're saying, well, I thought I would go to the store today. The well at the very beginning, you can hear a pause after it, that there's a comma after it, but that well, that's an interjection. So that's kind of a typical structure of a lot of interjections. You're going to see different ones like that too, but I mean, different types of interjections, but that's the gist of what an interjection is. It's an utterance. So it's something that we say to indicate to our audience that we're maybe unsure, or that we are taking a moment to think before providing a thoughtful response, or that we are trying to figure out what it is that we're saying as we're saying it, or something like that. Okay, so it kind of it provides clues and communication to your audience without being fitting into any of the other categories of grammatical like word order and classification. Okay, so now if you don't know what nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, conjunctions, prepositions, or interjections are, please let me know by next class so I can go into them in more in depth. I do kind of want to just continue here before we dive into math for the last bit. We'll take a break in a few minutes too, and then we'll do math. Okay, so subject, verb, object, word order. So English relies heavily on word order to convey meaning to a reader or speaker. Changing the order of words affects the meaning conveyed. Okay, so that's one thing that the SAT is going to test you on, is your knowledge of word order. So your knowledge of subject, verb, object, word order. That's typical. It doesn't mean that English can't have slight variations of that, because we have so many different ways that we can say things, almost like infinite possibilities of what we can say and how we can phrase it. But the general subject, generally English follows a subject, verb, object, word order. So you start with your subject, in which case we have the sentence, the cat climbed the tree. So verse, the tree climbed the cat. So those are two very different sentences and two very different ideas. A tree climbing the cat, I would expect to happen maybe in like Harry Potter or something like that, where you're dealing with something magical that's not actually in existence, or or something. But the cat climbed the tree, that's realistic. That's something I can believe would happen. And it's something that is logical because the cat is able to climb the tree. So it fits logic, but it also follows this subject verb word order where you have the cat being the subject of our sentence. So it's telling me who or what the sentence is about. And then you have the predicate, which is in essence the verb in the sentence, but it includes more than that. It tells me what is happening in the sentence, or what is being done to the subject, or what the subject is doing. So climbed the tree. So the tree fall is a noun as well, but it just like cat is in this sentence, but it's acting as the object that the cat climbs. Okay, so it's actually part of the predicate, and not the subject of our sentence. So the cat, the word cat in this sentence is the noun that is acting as the subject of the sentence. You could have a noun or a pronoun as the subject of a sentence. Okay. The little asterisk here after the sentence just kind of indicates that it's ungrammatical. That's just a linguistic way of explaining that this sentence doesn't actually fit logic. It doesn't actually work. So you also kind of want to think about, so generally speaking, you have subject. So you have a noun or a pronoun followed by a verb. So an action word of some sort, whether it's mental action, physical action, state of being, all of that, or kind of like a complement or something where you're dealing with the book is red, like something like that, like red as in the color, or yeah, red is in the color in that particular example that I was saying. So whereas the book and the is in that sentence is kind of acting as an equal sign. So it's kind of acting as a complement and saying book equals red, the color red, or green, book equals green. So something like that, where you're still expressing a state of a subject, and then you have an object that follows the verb. So subject, verb, object, that's what that means. Types of phrases, clauses, sentences, and the differences between them are other things that you need to know on this test. Types of sentences used in paragraphs and different genres of writing, types of punctuation and their grammatical function in a sentence, clause, or phrase. If you don't know what I mean by any of those words, email me, please, and I will go into more depth about with a more in-depth grammar review, but we will do more grammar review next week and look through the text that I introduced you to today. So also on this exam that you need to know for this section are how to organize and combine sentences and paragraphs and effectively convey ideas and transition between ideas, how to compose various written works to convey a particular message and achieve specific purposes using effective writing techniques, how to develop, explain, elaborate, and support ideas in writing, how to provide concrete evidence and source material and research. Essentially, these are your writing skills and writing and research skills that you use all the time in school, especially in an English class, but especially like in any research oriented class. So whether you're going into the sciences or you are doing humanities or math, you're always going to be doing writing of some sort. So writing skills are key on this section because it's the writing and language test. How to analyze, interpret, apply, assess, critique, and synthesize data from sources and infographics. Everything you've been doing on the reading test and the writing and language test to date is dealing with information and processing it and how to kind of apply it and think about it, and then convey information to other people about it, or ideas to other people about it. Okay. Dealing with like how to revise, edit writing to improve communication and expression of ideas, how to use particular writing and editing techniques to achieve your purpose in writing and to convey your message to your audience. Again, things I've all been saying from day one. Identifying and using types of figurative language, rhetorical strategies and techniques, literary and subject or genre specific terms and techniques in writing and speech. These are key kind of ideas that are covered on this test. So it's not just the kind of list of grammar terms that I gave you, although that's certainly part of it. This is a very much a writing and editing and thinking and reading type of test section of this test. So kind of key concepts to think about too are things like syntax, meaning the arrangement, grammatical structure, and organization of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences in a language. What is a sentence? Does anyone know what a sentence actually is? Please put it in the chat if you do. I'll give you about a minute to think about it. Arrangement of words. That's a good guess. It's a little bit more than that. Any other thoughts? A complete thought. That's it exactly. Okay, so all a sentence is the expression of a complete thought or idea. Okay, and if you think about it, it makes sense that you are expressing a complete thought or idea. Okay, so that's what a sentence is. But in order to have a sentence, in order to express a complete thought or idea, there are two key ingredients that you have to have in order to have a complete sentence. What do you think those ingredients might be? I'll give you a hint that I talked about it a little bit earlier. Any question, any like thoughts? Yes. Okay. So for those of you, I don't know if you came up with that on your own, probably, but it was also down here for everyone. And key grammar concepts to know. So dealing with a subject and a predicate. So in order to have a complete thought or idea, to essentially have a sentence, you need to have a subject and you need to have a predicate. In simplistic, the most simplistic form that we can possibly break it down to is that you need a noun or a pronoun acting as the subject of a sentence, and you need a verb, which is acting as the action that's in the sentence. It's telling me what's happening in the sentence, what the subject is doing, or what's being done to the subject. Okay, depending on the type of verbs that we're dealing with, or the tense or anything like that. But in essence, you need a noun or a pronoun. Okay, because a pronoun is a word that can take the place of a noun in a sentence. So you can use, specifically, you would need a subject pronoun to take the place of a noun acting as the subject of a sentence. So those would be things like he, she, it, they, we, you. It can also be I. And then depending on how the pronoun is being used, the form can change. So you can have an objective pronoun or an object pronoun. You can have possessive adjectives or possessive pronouns that are showing kind of ownership in relationships. There are other types of pronouns too, but those are kind of some of the main types that you see. But generally, when you're dealing with a sentence, you would need a noun or a pronoun acting as the subject of a sentence, so telling me who or what the sentence is about. And then you need a verb that is acting as the essentially the predicate. It is the predicate of the sentence. In essence, the predicate will always start with the verb, and it basically tells me what is being done to the subject or what the subject is doing, and what action and other kind of pertinent information about what's happening in the sentence to express the complete thought or idea. But if you don't have one or the other of those ingredients, like the subject, you're missing the subject or you're missing the predicate, you'll have a fragment. Okay, so that means that you have an incomplete sentence because it's missing one of the key ingredients it needs in order to be a complete thought or idea. So basically what that means is that you're dealing with like you always have to have a subject you always have to have a predicate in your sentence in order to express a complete thought or idea. Otherwise it's unclear. If you have a sentence where you have more than one idea in it and it continue like you have several ideas going on in the same sentence and it's kind of acting like a runaway train basically, because it just never stops and never ends. That's what's called a run-on sentence, where you have too many ideas in the sentence that they're actually separate sentences, separate ideas that need to be broken down using punctuation to separate them into their own distinct ideas. Am I glitching for anyone? A few people are like, was the video kind of glitching a little bit for some people? I do apologize if that's happening. It's not happening on my end, so I'm not sure. Okay, so it is happening for a few people. It might be the connection, the internet connection on your end. I apologize for that, but again, you're going to receive a copy of the video, so you can always kind of recap and see what you missed. All right, so that just kind of gives you a general idea here. So you need, in order to have a sentence, a lot of what the writing and language test is going to test you on is your knowledge of sentences, your knowledge of different types of sentences too. So that includes things like topic sentences, concluding sentences, knowing what a transitional phrase, like word or phrase is that's part of a sentence and how that functions within a sentence. So understanding kind of these general ideas about what sentences are, what they do, what all these different categories up here of words do, what their function is, what their usage is in a language to convey thoughts and ideas and expressions, kind of to convey information from a speaker or an author, a writer, to an audience, okay, or a listener, okay. So you want to kind of think about that as you kind of review some of these grammar skills going forward and identify any specific grammar skills that you don't understand that you need to go over, and let me know what those are. I'll go into more depth with this next week in terms of going through like the detail, the kind of categories that we have for like the different types of sentences we have, the kind of techniques of clauses and dealing with paragraph level, kind of argument level. I mean, these are all things that you really should know already, but kind of going through like the level approach, because there is a clear kind of hierarchy in terms of what level you're working on within a given question in this test, in this particular one. So you could be working on a word level, a phrase level, a clause level, a sentence level, which fall under what are called detail levels, because they're within a set constraint of a sentence. So they live in kind of that world of that sentence. So you're dealing with the basic idea level, the basic sentence level, sentence being the largest portion of the detail level type questions. And then main idea level is dealing with sentences. So within a paragraph, okay, so kind of grouping of sentences, dealing with kind of flow of ideas, logic, reasoning, paragraph structure, function, organization, varied sentence structure, transitions between ideas, and then also thinking about even like sections of a text, or which would be a kind of transition between the paragraph level and a more global level where you're dealing with central concepts, thesis, claims, motifs, themes, that kind of level is more of your global level of how do all these ideas that I have in this essay or this work come together, and how, like, what's the cohesion, what kind of context do I need, and kind of understanding the broader context beyond just what's written in the text, to like the life of a text, which I'm sure all of your English teachers have kind of honed in on, in terms of your analysis of particular works of literature, and or essays or things like that, and thinking about what's the author's intended meaning versus the literal interpretation of their words, or their intended message, or things like that. If you are continuing to have issues, it may be beneficial to try to log out and log back in. But again, everyone will always have access to the video after class. So if you miss anything, don't fret. You will be able to catch up on what you missed once you get the homework email for the week. Okay. So that's all I'm really going to say about the writing and language test for now. We're going to kind of take a 5-minute break in just a moment, so that we can kind of reorient ourselves and kind of work back through math. So we'll continue with this more in-depth grammar discussion. It was important, I think, to get through the reading test kind of recap. I'm hoping that everyone's familiar enough with it now and comfortable enough to continue practicing that and refining your own technique going forward. And that if you continue having questions, you can ask me, and that you continue to become more and more familiar with what the reading test is asking, as we do future tests, like chapter test readings regarding the reading test, as well as we kind of do our deep dive into grammar and the writing techniques and strategies to work through those specific skills that you need for this test, which I think is more involved in many ways than even your knowledge of specific content areas for the reading test. So really, with the reading test, once you've got your strategy, you want to keep practicing it and practicing it and practicing it until it just becomes like second nature for you, and refine your timing, work on identifying question types. All of that are things that you want to be doing. Writing and language test, you want to think about what you know about grammar, what you know about writing, how comfortable you are with writing, and understanding how language works, why we use it in certain ways, what specific genres are, all those kinds of big concepts that you're dealing with in an English class, or dealing with in any writing based class that that's very abstract or thinking based types of skills that you're going to be applying to these passages for this writing test, so that you can identify any concepts you need to review, or identify specific questions that you get wrong on the writing and language test in particular, or things that you think you know but you don't, and you just need to revisit. So those are kinds of key things that you want to think about going forward. So we're going to actually take a quick break for about 5 minutes. So we'll kind of reconvene now at 10:48. It's 10:43 right now. So if I did my math right, that should be 10:48 that we're going to be reconvening. So 5 minutes, everyone can get a snack, can have water or whatever you need. And we'll come back and we'll kind of switch gears and go back to math. Okay. So I will see everyone in just a few minutes. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so everyone should be back now from a quick 5-minute break. We are going to get started with math. So you should all see on your screen the reading from math that was from the College Board's website. My apologies, I was muted that entire time. I thought I unmuted myself. I guess I did not. So just to kind of recap, everyone should be back now from a quick 5-minute break. We should be starting with math now. So everyone should see on your screen the reading for about the SAT math test, which is available on the College Board's website directly. So this is the chapter that would be in the big blue book for SAT prep, which I have right here, upside down. My apologies. SAT. So I have too many texts. Goodness. But this is actually chapter 15 in your textbook for any of you who have it. And it just kind of goes through about the different sections. So you're kind of dealing with about the math section. So you have an about chapter about each section, as we just kind of went through earlier today with the writing and language test and the reading test. But you have different kinds of questions. So here, this is kind of what the chapter really looks like. Sorry, I was looking for it. What the chapter really kind of starts with. Chapter 5, it should be chapter 15, yes, in here. So it's kind of talking really about a breakdown about the kind of math that is focused on in this particular section. So there's a lot of overlap, even though the chapter looks a little bit different in this in the textbook versus how it's appearing on here, but it's really the same content. It's talking about the focus of the heart of algebra, the problem solving and data analysis, the passport to advanced math, all the different kinds of math questions or categories of questions and skills that you will be focusing on in the math test. So we do kind of want to keep that in mind, that even though this section doesn't look exactly like it is in the textbook, if you have the textbook, it's still the same material. Okay, so it's just like the same thing with the reading test from this morning and the writing and language test. It's still the same information, although the test makers have just kind of rearranged how they've done things on their website a little bit between earlier this year and now. But that kind of being said, if we kind of look here, so we know, I mean, we've discussed it a bit before, but the math test really kind of covers a range of different math practices with kind of an emphasis on problem solving, modeling, and using tools strategically, and using algebraic structure. Instead of really testing you on every math topic out there, they're really asking you on real life types of situations. So it's dealing with being able to problem solve and model what you'll do. One, model it so that other people can follow it and be able to use and apply math. So it's more applied math than mathematical theory. So it's not like anything that's really abstract theory that you're not going to be able to use in a concrete application. So instead, it's really kind of focusing on the college level math, science, and social sciences course that you're really going to be using this type of math in. It's going to be dealing with math that you'll use in the jobs that you hold or in your personal life. It's focused on key skills for being an adult, basically, for working in the real world, for figuring out how to solve complex issues when like with a variable, or if you are doing basic math type skills and applying that, or interpreting information from a given like infographic or chart or graph or something like that, or coordinate plane, things like that are applicable in and practical. Okay, so it's not necessarily focusing on complex theory. It's not focusing on like super advanced math. It's focusing on math that you've learned from about middle school through early high school. Okay, so generally for most students it's early high school, but it's focusing on things that you should be familiar with in terms of algebraic concepts, in terms of using arithmetic and mathematics, in terms of like general problem solving, and just kind of skills that you can use that are easily transferable to the science, a career in the sciences, that are applicable in doing scientific research or in doing historical research or in dealing with social sciences and doing like psychological research or something of that nature that requires knowledge of math, use of math, application of math, and being able to prove and interpret and analyze and demonstrate knowledge and competency in key mathematical areas. Okay, so it's not going to be asking you to do like advanced calculus on this particular SAT test. It's going to be looking at your knowledge of these kind of core concepts, foundational concepts of math, and your ability to kind of demonstrate and figure out how to solve certain questions, while kind of keeping in mind that most questions in the math section can be solved multiple ways. So that is kind of one of the best strategies to take on this math section, which I've talked about before, is to kind of consider that there are many different ways on this test to solve a problem. Okay, so however many, I mean, it's like writing. You can interpret writing or reading passages in many different ways in most contexts. Sometimes there's one interpretation that is better or more advisable than another, but otherwise there are many different ways to approach it. The key to success on the math section is to approach it in the method, using the method that is easiest for you. Okay, that's going to vary from every student. And thinking about, like, some of you might be better at algebra, some of you might hate algebra, or have had bad experiences with it, or some might feel better using geometry than they'd feel using just like other kinds of math. So I mean, it just depends on you and your own comfort level with material. That's not to say that you don't want to try to learn multiple ways to solve a problem, but the best strategy for approaching a given math section is to solve figure out what the problem is asking, identifying key information, including annotating your questions, which I've talked to you about before. But you want to make sure that you are finding what it is that they're actually asking you to solve for, and that you're identifying that information from the question so that you keep it in your mind, you keep focus on what it is that they're actually asking you to do. Because chances are they're going to throw some additional information in there that's irrelevant, that you don't actually need, that is going to be there just to trip you up, basically. That they're going to be including it to try to get you to think about doing something with more complex math than you actually need to solve the problem in most cases. Okay, so you always want to try to solve it in the easiest method possible, or at least the easiest method for you. Okay, so that might vary from student to student, but they're not going to throw things that you shouldn't be somewhat familiar with going into this test. Okay, so a lot of these skills you might not have used since middle school. A lot of these skills you might not have used since your last math class. Or if you're not comfortable with math, don't fret. You can still use strategies like process of elimination to help you make informed decisions. You can use estimation to, and like plugging in numbers for variables to try to help you solve a question. You can use all those basic skills that you use on just about any math test to help you solve for what you need to solve for in the time allotted, so that you can get through and answer as many questions as possible and have the highest chance to get as many of them right as possible. Okay, so it's still feasible, even if you feel like math isn't your strong suit. Most of it is just practice, practice, practice. And there are certain types of questions that you'll see on this test that are consistent in terms of, and they're covered really in more depth in the math videos that have been accompanying our weekly kind of homework emails. So I advise you to really look through those because they give a more comprehensive breakdown of certain question types. But this is all kind of information that you want to consider when you're looking through the math section, when you're trying to address them. So the two kind of main points about the math test is that there are two tests. Basically, you have a calculator portion, which is your fourth section of the exam. And then you have the non-calculator math section, which comes before that, which is the third section of your test. So generally speaking, the order in which you've seen the sections of your exam appear in your practice test, that's the order in which they typically will appear. So you'll start with your reading test, go to your writing and language test, and then you have your first math section, which is non-calculator. In which case you shouldn't even have your calculator on your desk, but you should have it with you, easily accessible for when you're allowed to have it on your desk for taking the fourth section, which is the calculator section. You also, for the math section as part of your prep, want to make sure you have a good graphing calculator, that you have a good calculator that you can rely on, that you're comfortable using, that you're familiar with in terms of using the different functions, using to solve different kinds of problems, because now is the time for you to be kind of reading through your manual if you don't know how to use your calculator to solve for specific types of questions, or use particular functions, like to graph a parabola or something like that, so that you can use that and have that available and you're ready to go, basically, to take the test. Okay, so I mean, that's one thing that you really kind of want to think about is, do I have my materials? Am I comfortable with my calculator? Do I know how to do the kinds of math that I've seen on the test so far? Does it make sense to me why I've gotten certain questions wrong or why I've gotten certain questions right if I felt like I guessed on something? So those kinds of things, again, just like you think about with like you analyze kind of your answers and responses for the writing and language test and the reading tests, you also want to be doing that on the math test. So you want to be able to identify where you went wrong in your problem solving, and where the information was in the question or in a particular graph or infographic that accompanies the particular question that you were answering. So maybe you missed certain information. So again, doing more of like the careless reading or the kind of just misunderstanding what like making a quick reading error in, or not noting, making enough notations in the question itself to identify key information to be able to solve the question, or paying enough attention to the formula sheet that they give you at the beginning of each math section, because chances are they've given you the formula sheet. There's going to be something on your test related to that formula sheet, but they're not going to tell you about it. And it's maddening for me as a teacher and a tutor when students get a question wrong that they could easily have gotten right if they just paid attention to the formula that was on their answer on the beginning of the test that the test makers gave you. It's one thing if you don't remember formula from things that you have to kind of memorize and work in for additional types of problems that you might see. But to miss something that you had all the information available to you and you just didn't read carefully enough, or you didn't remember and check your answer, your formula sheet to make sure there was nothing there that could help you solve the question, or whether or not a student makes like a careless error in terms of forgetting to show their work or something, that they're not careful in showing every single step, or that they're not careful in circling their answer or identifying the units or something for their response and give the wrong answer or something like that. So like you want to be able to eliminate any possible chance of making a careless error in terms of your step-by-step process of solving a given question, but you also want to make sure that you eliminate any chance that you're going to miss the key information by doing underlining and other annotation, like circling key, like proper nouns and numbers. Again, like those types of things, you want to identify that information in a question so that you can break it down and identify, okay, this is the information that they've given me. This is what I actually need to take from that. And this is how I can solve it now. And then just solve it and then check your work and then find your answer in the answer choices and mark it on your answer sheet. Again, process of elimination, dealing with estimation, all of those types of things and kind of plugging in numbers are going to be helpful for the majority of questions. You also will have to do some actual solving for a lot of things, but sometimes you can find an easier solution than the one that they're trying to get you to make. Okay, and you always want to go for the easiest solution for you and the easier method if possible, because you don't want to be, because more complicated methods of solving an equation or a problem are going to lead to more time being wasted or spent on a given question than you have the luxury of spending on that section. Okay, does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay, so this section kind of going about like on the College Board's website is really just kind of breaking down for you what this section's about. So all of you should have done this reading. If you didn't, you can access it through the link in the first document I shared in class today, which is the one that you received for the first week of with me, which is the second week of this course. So basically, some parts of the, like, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward math test, at least more so than the grayer area that you see for the reading test and the writing language test, which isn't always a straightforward answer. It is more straightforward because you're dealing with math, but it isn't always, the way in which you solve it is not always straightforward. And that's where it can vary, and that's where you can kind of get some confusion and some complexity in solving a particular equation. So heart of algebra is one of the key kind of content areas. So there's going to be a lot of algebra on this test. Okay, it's going to be focusing specifically on things like mastery of linear equations and systems. So it's going to be kind of confined to those types of skills for the most part, but you do want to know what a coefficient is, what a constant is, what the equation for a straight line, all of those types of things, and being able to graph them, or what a number line is, things like that you want to really kind of think about in terms of their kind of general content that you might not have, that you haven't visited in a while. Okay, you want to kind of revisit those concepts so that you can really understand them, and also think about the mathematical concepts that they're based in. Because a lot of the time in algebra, we're dealing with things like the distributive property, or the associative property, or commutative property, or things like that, or other rules like regulating number use and operations and things like that. So like the order of operations and things like that, that are kind of key foundational skills that you really want to know going into this test and be solid on, to also then think about how are those general mathematical concepts then applied to algebra? How do I use them in algebra? How do I use them when I'm just dealing with arithmetic? What do they mean? And if you're not sure what those mean, you definitely need to look them up, or pay attention to the videos that are provided every week about the math, but also kind of review those concepts or let me know so I can discuss them in particular. But you do want to kind of think about those concepts, because the more familiar you are with those concepts and the more comfortable you are in using them and applying them, the easier the algebra type questions are going to be for you. Okay, so you want to be able to know what the math is that builds, like that is the foundation of those algebraic kind of properties and things like that, and rules and regulations, and how to apply it in algebra. But you need to know how the math works behind the scenes, behind the algebra, to understand really fully what the algebra is doing in and of itself. Okay, so problem solving and data analysis is really about being what they call quantitatively literate. It means being able to interpret information, basically analyze it, assess it, apply it, break it down, and just kind of figure out the best method to, without being told how to, not like without being told that you have to solve something a certain way. Just, it's basically your application of math. It's your ability to focus on how to problem solve questions when a teacher doesn't actually say, solve this using y equals mx plus b, or something like, when they're not actually giving you like spoon feeding you the information. Okay, they want to know what you can remember about math, and how comfortable you are with using it, and how comfortable you are at finding solutions when someone doesn't give you a step-by-step way to do it. Okay, when you're kind of faced with a real world situation where you have to then interpret and analyze. And this is especially true for things like science-based inquiries, or type of questions that you'll see on this test, because you're really looking at they're looking at your ability to interpret information. So doing a lot of data reasoning type of questions, but also dealing with breaking down and analyzing and applying that information, and being able to propose solutions, propose your own creative solutions to solving a problem. Because remember, again, on this test, or on the math test in particular, you have many different ways that you can solve most problems. So they want to see, which method do you choose, and why? And did we outwit you on this test, or did you outwit us on this test, in terms of finding an easier solution to a complex problem, what could be a complex problem, if you solve it in a particular way? Okay, does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. Passport to Advanced Math is another math section here, a math concept grouping, which or categorization, which is really kind of focused on questions that require the manipulation of complex equations. So these will be your harder questions in most cases. These will be the questions that require longer answers or longer time solving them. And generally speaking, you want to save them till the end, you want to try to identify those specific types of questions that are going to take the most time. And just like with the reading and the writing and language tests, you want to start with the easiest questions on the test for you, and you want to build to the harder questions, because the harder questions require more time. And by solving the easier questions first, you have a higher chance of getting more questions right, because you don't linger over the hard questions first. You linger over, you spend time solving the ones that you can definitely get right first, which are the easier ones. And then you are building so that you give yourself extra time at the end to kind of try to work through some of the more complex ones. There are actual additional topics in math that include things like geometry and some trigonometry and like trigonoanalysis, or pre-calc type questions, that are the most relevant to kind of college and career readiness. So they're just kind of testing the waters of your like understanding of geometry and kind of trigonometry and how to apply those types of skills for higher level math. Especially those would be especially important if you plan to go into a math or science type of field, in terms of your scores. Whereas of course, if you're going into more of a humanities or arts-based type of major in college, then you most likely will want to be prioritizing the verbal section. So the reading test and writing and language test, what's the evidence-based reading and writing section of the exam. Although not in every case, you still want to be well-rounded. So you want to have kind of comparable scores overall in both sections, for both types of both kind of breakdown for the two breakdown between the two math sections and then the kind of reading and writing type sections. But these are kinds of things that if you haven't tackled geometry or trigonometry, you might want to see these for last, in terms of your questions and answering them, or learn how, spend the time now to kind of learn through some of these math skills. But practice is going to be kind of what you need to do to get ahead with this. Okay, so the College Board also kind of gives you a quick little video about what to expect on the SAT math test. That's useful to kind of look through. And it also kind of goes through a breakdown of what the math test measures. So they're calling it fluency in terms of your ability to be proficient in math, basically, like your ability to quickly identify problem and solve problems, and use the most effective or most efficient solution. So that's kind of testing your ability to identify that, hey, this question could be solved multiple ways, but I'm not going to use the complex math version. I'm going to use a simpler math version because it'll take less time and it's more effective for me to solve it this way, but I understand that there is another way. So that kind of thing, different things like that. Okay, so also understanding, like conceptual understanding of particular math concepts, operations and relations, especially between numbers and properties and types of equations and graphs and all of that. Understanding applications. So again, this is an application-based math test. Okay, so it's not asking you to do abstract thinking about mathematical concepts. It's not asking you to write the next kind of E equals MC squared type equation. You're not doing physics in terms of like doing groundbreaking work in physics or anything like that. You're working on identifying real world solutions and real world problems, to be able to analyze the situation, determine essential elements required to solve the problem. So underlining, annotating, key, that's key. So you want to make sure you're circling proper nouns and numbers, as I've said time and time again. And you also want to be able to identify and kind of like represent the problem mathematically. So you can kind of think about the problem in terms of like being able to understand what it's asking, why it's asking it in a certain way, and what kind of method they're leading you to think that you need to solve it for, and then how you can actually carry out a solution that will solve it in less time. Okay, does that make sense? So again, they kind of go over, I'm not going to go through everything, but they do kind of go through the calculator use. So it's helpful to kind of look through that and the grid in type questions. So there are two kinds of questions, ones that are just straightforward multiple choice. And then you have the grid in questions. So 22% are for on the math test are also known as grid ins, which are the student produced response questions. Okay, so instead of choosing a correct answer, as I'm sure all of you have seen and done, you are solving problems and entering your answers in the grids provided on the answer sheet. So this is in part so I think they can see how you've solved a question, whether or not you can reach a right answer without being kind of spoon fed the multiple choice potential answers. Okay, does that all make sense? So you want to be very careful when you're filling out your answer sheet section so that you can really follow these guidelines here that they're outlining here in this section about gridding and answers, so that you can like mark no more than one circle in any column. Only answers indicated by filling in the circle will be scored. So you need to basically, you won't actually receive credit for anything written in the boxes located above the circles. So you technically do have to fill in the circle because it's like a Scantron, basically, that they need to be able to identify what your answer is electronically. But they do want you to actually like physically solve it. So that's why they want you to fill in the blank too. Okay, so it doesn't matter in which column you begin entering your answers, as long as the responses for the grid in section, as long as your responses are recorded within the grid area, you'll receive credit. So that's a positive. The grid can hold only 4 decimal places and can only accommodate positive numbers and 0. Okay, so that limits your potential answers. That would be right, but that is kind of helping you make sure that you have the right answer. Okay, because it tells you what it can't be, so you can eliminate those as possibilities in your answer. So if you create an answer that ends up with a negative or a decimal that has more than 4 decimal places, you have to reduce it so that you can, or you need to be able to indicate that to a certain extent. Okay, so that you can make sure that it fits this criteria. Okay, unless a problem indicates otherwise, answers can be entered on the grid as a decimal or as a fraction. Okay, so you do kind of like, if you do something like with fractions, like 3 over 24, you do not need to be reduced to their lowest terms. So fractions like that don't need to be reduced. You can just put in the fraction. That isn't to say that I think you can't put in a reduced and lowest terms, but it doesn't mean that you actually have to actually bother going through and doing the reduction to lowest terms. Sometimes they tend to provide or accept multiple responses if you provide like an equivalent, like if you do reduce it or not, but you don't necessarily have to reduce it in order to put your answer in, so long as it fits in the box. That's kind of the key. All mixed numbers need to be converted to improper fractions before being recorded in the grid. So that's something important that you do need to know and you do need to be aware of as you go through and do your grid in responses for the math section. If the answers are repeating decimals, students must grid the most accurate value the grid will accommodate. Okay, so here we have a fraction, 7/12. So you have a fraction line. So you can either use it here or here. and then you grid in your response. Okay, so here's 7, here's the slash, here's the 1 and the 2. Okay, and then the same kind of thing with the period for the decimal. So either a fraction or a decimal for your response. Either of these responses are correct for 200, for an answer of 201. So it doesn't really matter so long as you're, I would just say consistency is key for your own practice. So that way you're not like confusing yourself going through. So here is an example of what I was talking about, how they can accept multiple responses. So you could put this in, if your response was 2/3, you could say, you could put it in as a fraction. So 2 with the slash and then the 3. You could put it in as a decimal where you indicate it is a completely repeating decimal where you're not rounding it like you do in this last one. Okay, so then they clearly rounded it, but all of these are acceptable responses. Okay, so some answers can be more than one type of response. All answers for this section will be as either a decimal of some sort or a fraction, is basically what they're saying. Okay, so unless the problem indicates otherwise. Okay, so it can be entered as a decimal or as a fraction in most cases. Okay. Yeah, so we have that. For this week, you will be starting to read through the Heart of Algebra section, which is again online for the math sections. The reading content is available in a PDF, I think I gave, or another, it'll open in a link for you so that you have that, but it will kind of break down for you what this section is about, to give you just a general idea about this particular area of content or this particular categorization of the math problems in particular. I will double check, but I think you're also reading this chapter, problem solving and data analysis. Actually, let me check now. So people can kind of make a kind of note about it. So this week you have practice test 9. And then you're reading chapter 7 and then 11 to 12 and then 16. You're just reading chapter 16 this week. Okay. So you're reading more than just chapter 16, but you're reading more than one chapter in the writing and language test, I believe. Okay, so you'll be reading, I believe I said chapter 6. So you're doing one kind of additional information, more information about the reading and the reading test. So about information ideas. You're also going to be reading, I think it was chapter 11 and 12 for writing and language. So you're looking at expression of ideas and standard English conventions. And then you're reading chapter 16 about the heart of algebra. That's kind of where you're going to be in terms of your reading for this week. Yeah, chapter 7, 11 to 12, and 16. Okay, so those are all accessible through the notes document that I gave you for the first class, that I was with you. So we'll kind of get into that. But that kind of gives you an idea, just to sort of recap before I look at our practice tests for the rest of the time. I do want to kind of point out to you that the first 2 chapters of part 2, what I have labeled here as part 2, were related to reading and writing skills in particular. So this covers both. So it deals with words and context, which you've seen on both the writing language test in terms of vocabulary, as well as like vocabulary and context type questions or diction type questions. And the same thing for the reading test. Okay. You'll also see command of evidence, so your ability to kind of provide evidence to support the ideas that are being conveyed. So those are kind of key things that you wanted to kind of look at. I specifically today was focused more on breaking down each of the types of the particular tests on the exam. So you have the reading test, writing and language test, and the 2 math tests. Although they don't really break down each of the 2, like them into separate. It's just the main difference is that certain sections of the 4th section of the test requires calculator work, the other doesn't. So that's the main difference between those types of questions, but you're still seeing the same types of questions. They're just ones that can be solved with a calculator, or some or ones that have to be solved with a calculator for the most part, or ones that don't need a calculator. The other thing that you also kind of want to keep in mind when you're dealing with a math test is that just because they are a calculator is available to you, that doesn't mean that that's the best or most effective way to solve the question. So sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes it can't be avoided and you have to use a calculator to solve a question. But chances are there could possibly be another way to solve a given question without having to bother using a calculator. So it just depends on your ability to kind of break down and find a solution that requires a calculator or doesn't. Okay. Or how complex the calculator work is that you have to do will also vary. Okay. So that being said, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit now that we've kind of gone a little bit over the general idea of the math test. I'll go into more depth next week about the math, the kinds of math questions that you'll see specifically. But I do want you to kind of bear in mind that they're going to be a bit different, like it's going to vary. There's going to be a kind of wide range of questions. I wanted to look at our kind of annotations for the reading and writing and language test first before we delve into the math. I just have to find the right document. Sorry, I have multiple documents for this one. I'm going to send out just one document to everyone for this week. My scanner wasn't cooperating when I initially scanned all this. So everyone should now kind of see practice test 10 on their screen. I do kind of want to just quickly recap how you should approach or not approach a reading test. So no reading test should ever be blank like this. Okay. So, I mean, in terms of reading passage should ever be blank like this. I did this so that you can see as an example of what it should not be. Okay. Specifically, you should underline, there's a lot of keywords in here. You can see like Mavis Davis, Miss Bivy, Miss Chandler, Rock of Gibraltar, Dr. Janet Miller, they're Atlantic Ocean, Morocco, Tunis and Algiers, Africa, Baghdad. They're all camels is just capitalized. It's not being used as a proper noun. It's just because it's part of the beginning of a sentence. But it's italicized here, so you might want to underline it, like things like that. So you want to make sure there are a whole lot of proper nouns, like 3-Step Georgia, August 1938. There are so many proper nouns and other kind of pertinent information. Columbia University, Barnyard College, Nashville, Tennessee, all of these different things that 1938, there's so much information, WPA, that you want to make sure you have circled and underlined. And if you haven't, you're going to miss out on figuring out where, like in this one in particular, there are a lot of dates, like 119 degree, or a lot of numbers, 119. You're dealing with French, Paris, London. There's so much going on here in terms of content. One afternoon, like different things like that you're looking at, that you want to make sure, age 13, 7th grader, things like that you want to key in on, or hone in on, really, so that you can find these things when you're looking for it, because chances are there's a question about it. Okay, so you always want to be underlining and annotating and everything. Okay, so you should never look like this for your passage. There should be some underlining, some circling. I'd expect this to really look like lots of circling in this one, because there are lots of things to circle. Does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. Did anyone have any particular questions on the reading test or the writing and language test sections for practice 10 that they wanted to go over today? Before we move on to more of the math again. If you do, please let me know in the chat or in the Q&A. If there were questions that you didn't understand or were unsure about or weren't sure how to label, please let me know. Everyone's good? Everyone did like a perfect score on this section, or you know what you did wrong? Mm-hmm. All right, then I'm going to dive into a question here. So here with the first one, I have it listed as both an inferencing question and a text detail. So technically it's a text detail because it's incorporating information found directly in the text. Okay, so it can be found, evidence can be found in the text, but it's also kind of an inferencing question here, because you have to not only interpret that information from the text about the narrator. For the question in this case is the narrator of the passage can best be described as. So you as the reader are being asked to make a judgment based on your knowledge of a given character or of the narrator here. So you're being asked to infer information, or like to make a judgment based on your inferencing of like what the subtext is going on in this whole narration. Okay. So you're being asked to, based on the evidence in the text, but also to take that evidence that you're using to help kind of support your ideas about what the narrator, who the narrator is, and just information about the narrator here, and how to describe them. So you have to go based off of information that's directly in the text, but you also have to kind of infer information from the text beyond that, and then make a judgment based off of the information you've kind of gleaned from the text overall, including your inferencing. Okay, so then you have to make a conclusion based on the choices that they give you, or based on like your knowledge of that narrator, to be able to find the right answer here. Okay, in which case A is the correct answer, one of Miss Vivi's former students. Okay, and there's evidence for that. And if you're not sure where to find that, let me know. I can point that out for you. But those are the kinds of things that you want to think about. And remember, like question 3 is much more direct in the fact that it's an inferencing question because it says it. But question 1 is also kind of inferencing because of even though it's not saying it's inferencing. So much of the time you'll see them as like inferencing questions will jump out to you as like it's being suggested or it's being inferred, or they'll use similar kind of language to just to describe that kind of, or it can be alluded that, or assumed that, like something like that, that their phrasing is going to give you a clue that you're dealing with an inferencing type question. However, it doesn't happen all the time, and you have to think about what is it actually asking me to do and what am I doing when I'm thinking, to kind of figure out what type of question it is in terms of your approach of when you should approach that question. Does that make sense? Yeah. So no one has any questions, at least on passage 1, right? Any from passage 2 or any of the other passages for the reading test or the writing and language test? Now's the time to ask. So while you're kind of thinking about that and trying to find questions for me, to ask in the chat, I do kind of want to point out that you should also be, making notes in the infographic, or like on the infographics in that area. So in which case the kind of blurb about the infographics, both of them, is found at the very bottom of the second one for figure 1 and 2. And you want to kind of pay attention to the information that they give you for each figure, because it can be confusing, and they deliberately try to confuse you in how it's organized sometimes. So you want to make sure that you're clear about what each kind of infographic is asking. Okay. So let's kind of take a quick look. You should be circling things like figure 2, figure 1, like I did here for the data response type questions, and underlining. You don't have to do double underlining unless I just ended up doing that. Single underlining is really what you would have time for. So don't waste extra time doing double underlining unless you feel it's really important, in which case make another note, like make a little star next to it or something that gives you an indication that it's an important fact or something. Any questions about from questions 22 to 32? Again, this has a lot of things that you need to circle. There's a lot of numbers in here. There are a lot of kind of units even that I would include with the number, like between 2 to 10 centimeters per second. I probably would have circled the whole thing. 35 and 75 meters per second, dealing like 1 meter a second, dealing with 1993, all those types of things. GL, like the abbreviation CT, C tactile or CT fibers, low threshold, all those types of things. I even circled early 1990s in this one, 1993, all these types of things. No questions on the reading test or the writing and language test. So if we skip to the writing and language test, the same thing here, passage 1, passage 2. So you want to make sure you're focusing in on key elements in each of the questions as you read through. No questions from Life Under the Sun either. Again, you have an infographic down here that you don't want to forget about when you're going through the passage. So it's in the middle of a passage, or at the actually very end of a passage. So it's still relevant, and you want to make sure that you are giving it information and or giving it time to kind of break down and figure out what it is saying and how it relates to the passage. Okay, so no questions on this one. What about the writing and language test? Parallel structure. Everyone know what that means? Conjunction. Yeah, okay. Non-essential clause, combining sentences, concision, logic, syntax, main clause with introductory phrase. It needs a subject, because remember, a lot of the time they're going to be looking for something related to, does it have a subject? Does it have a predicate? Do you know what those mean? Do you know whether it's a complete thought or idea? Why? Why not? Unnecessary addition, repetition, past participles, comma usage to separate dependent phrase from independent clause. Again, the CCT means central concept, thesis, or theme, those types of things. Gerund, parallel structure, again, transitional phrase, emphasizes and directs reader to the criticism, things like that, like kind of comments in terms of making connections with things. Plural noun, plural possessive noun, clarity, relevance, infinitive. So dealing with an infinitive in terms of a verb. Parallel structure, again, is a popular one, at least on this test. Diction, precision of language, vocabulary and context, semicolon usage, separating independent clauses, logic flow, comparison of ideas, all of that. I do have other sections of this. Okay. And as I said, my scanner when I initially did this was not cooperating well. Present perfect tense, understanding what that means with a verb. Idiomatic phrases. Everyone's good with all of this? Okay, if everyone is good with all that. Conjunctional list, transitional phrases, relative pronouns, ideas, sentence structure or sentence construction, dealing with subject and predicate, noun and verb. That's exactly what we talked about today for 37. Being able to identify the most appropriate form. Okay. So also dealing with kind of subject verb agreement, all of those types of things. Subordinating conjunctions. Okay. No one had any questions on this section. Okay, then I'm going to open practice test 10 and look at some of the math for our last little bit. Everyone should also be familiarizing yourself with the College Board's website. So if you haven't done that, you need to do that. And that's because there's key information for you about the exam, about testing centers, things like that, that are there that you want to kind of be aware of kind of going through. So everyone, bear with me as I pull up practice test 10. So if you're not sure, this is a place where you can go on the College Board's website. If it's under the practice section. I'm getting tongue-tied. It's getting late in the morning here. SAT practice tests. All of you should have been able to find these. You can start an online practice test as an extra. If you want to do some extra work, you can do that. You can also go down to practice tests down here, which is what we're looking at. So practice test 10 is what I wanted to pull up. They have the documents there for you, which are the documents that get sent to you every week. Okay. So practice test 10, we've kind of looked through. I'm just trying to get to the math section. No calculator section. Okay. So everyone really should be familiar with the directions for the math sections because it's pretty much the same kind of question, kind of instructions for the calculator and non-calculator section. The only difference is whether you can use the calculator, really. Okay. So on the non-calculator section, which is the first math section you get, you have 20 questions in 25 minutes. Okay. And questions 1 to 15, you're solving each problem for multiple choice questions. And then you have 4 questions or like 5 questions from 16 to 20, really, that are so 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, where you're solving it and putting it on the grid in the answer sheet. Okay. And any available space in your test booklet is available for scratch work, for scrap paper, for you for solving equations. Use of a calculator is not permitted, so you want to make sure it is off your desk at that time when you're working on this section of the test. All variables and expressions used represent real numbers unless otherwise indicated. If you do not know what a real number is, please email me and let me know so we can discuss it in class. Or I can speak with you to clarify that, okay? But everyone should know what a real number is and in terms of the types of numbers that you're dealing with on this test, okay? Figures provided in this test are drawn to scale unless otherwise indicated, okay? So that is at least helpful as opposed to it not being drawn to scale, which makes it harder for us. But that is definitely a plus here. All figures lie in a plane unless otherwise indicated. Also helpful. Unless otherwise indicated, the domain of a given function f is the set of all real numbers x for which the function of x is a real number. Okay. If you don't know what that means, please let me know and we can kind of go through that. But it should be, I believe that's gone over in the math videos too. But looking here, make sure you are familiar with all of these different formulae, okay? So that you can use them, apply them, remember that they're here for you. It's kind of them to provide an actual formula sheet. I don't think they always provide it. At least I don't remember them always providing some kind of answer sheet. I think for a lot of it, they used to require students to memorize it. So be thankful that you actually have an answer sheet or you have a formula sheet here that you're allowed to use. If you don't know what these mean, let me know and we can go through them. But chances are these are the most common formula that you will use on this test, okay? Because they put them here for a reason, okay? The number of degrees of arc in a circle is 360. So remember to read this kind of wordy section down at the bottom here, because it has key information. Like I think one of your practice test questions last week or the week before involved degrees and angles of a triangle, in which case this last one came to be very important. Did anyone have any specific questions? So you have like basic like algebraic equations. You have function type questions. You have like kind of arithmetic type questions, basically just using variables. You have like you have like using XY planes and figuring out straight lines and different things like that, figuring out curves, square roots with variables and squared exponents, and different things like that. So understanding angles, understanding segments, like line segments and things like that. These are all kind of key concepts. Understanding and identifying graphs and parabolas and things like that. Dealing with triangles, especially right triangles, all of these types of things. Understanding like the Pythagorean theorem, all of those types of things are really kind of key on this test. Trying to see if there's anything else, making you kind of choose between multiple and choosing only one of these answers, or both, or neither, and being able to determine that. Does that kind of all make sense? And then here, having you solve for like absolute value, dealing with, but with variables, and dealing with equations with multiple variables, all of that type of thing. Okay, so there are dealing with different kinds of forms that we see with numbers, and combining different types of variable expressions, things like that. So again, kind of the only difference between the instructions for this section is that you have 55 minutes, 38 questions, 1 to 30, rather than the, what was it, 1 to 15 before, and then 31 to 38. So you have more questions that are focused on the grid type style of response for this test, because you have more questions in general. And so that makes sense. And then the only kind of key differences here is really that the use of the calculator is permitted. That's everything else is kind of really the same between the two math sections. You still have basically the same exact formula sheet. And again, it's equally important for you to know that. All of that type of thing. Again, basic kind of algebraic expressions and equations, dealing with lines, dealing with kind of graphing, key skills that can be applied in everyday life, dealing with basic functions, algebraic expressions, kind of figuring out how to solve for a given variable, interpreting information, dealing with powers, dealing with like variables, tables, comparing and contrasting kind of information, looking at and making sure that you, like questions 13 and 14 focus more on information provided in this infographic here, in this graph. So they're requiring you to not only read this information about this graph, but to read the graph itself and retain that information for applying it in these two different contexts. Okay. So you always want to make sure you pay careful attention to what the graph is showing, or what the infographic is showing, what they're telling you about the infographic. And here is where you definitely want to be annotating and underlining and kind of circling key information, making sure it's clear so that you can go back and reread it, because you have more than one question to answer about it. And then focusing in on and identifying from each question related to that infographic, which specific ones that you need to look at. Okay, so that's kind of it for today. To this week, you're going to be working on practice test 9. I'll send out the homework as soon as I can, so that you all have that, including any chapter readings listed, which you can access through the initial notes document I gave you earlier this year, or this course. And that we will be reconvening next week. And if you don't understand anything we've kind of gone over so far, please let me know so we can go into it in more depth. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that you know it. So we have about, any questions before we kind of leave? But otherwise, I think that everyone did a great job today. I hope your studies are kind of going well. If not, please let me know. Okay, so someone did ask, are we already signed up for the SAT or do we have to sign up ourselves? You should check with your school, because I believe the majority of you are taking it at your school. Check with your teachers, make sure that you're not automatically signed up for it because you're part of this class. I can check in with Embrace to see if they have additional information for you, but you do want to at least familiarize yourself with the registration process in the event that you do need to sign up for an administration outside of school. But I believe the bulk of you, like the majority of you, will be taking it in a school environment, but you should check with your school and your teachers first at school, whoever's administering this particular program for you, because they should have additional information for you. Okay. So if that's it, then we're done for today, and I will see everyone next week. If you have additional questions, please email me, and I can address that going forward. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you all next week. Take care.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.